Hey everyone, Rose here, and welcome back to another Blender sculpt. Since this is my last sculpt for October, I decided to sculpt a little bat character. I'm using the Blender 2.92 Alpha. I originally wanted to use Blender 2.91, which is in beta now. However, the sculpt vertex color features were removed from the beta, so I switched to the Alpha since that still has the features. By the way, if any of you are interested in using those features and can't find them or can't get them to work, in the beginning of my Lily sculpting video, I show where you can find them. They are a bit hidden in the preferences. With that out of the way, on with a time-lapse. To begin with, I add in a couple of spheres, or rather subdivided cubes, and use my snake hook tool to shape them into the general shapes for the snout, face, and ears. Then I go in with my clay strips brush, my crease brush, and my smooth brush to add in some more details. I pretty much only ever use these 4 brushes for sculpting. I only use other brushes in very specific situations, which I'll get to a little bit later. Next, I grab 2 more spheres and use them to shape out the body, again using the snake hook tool. And with that done, I move on to the wings. I model out the basic skeleton kind of part of the wing, with just edges and vertices, and add a skin modifier on top of that to give it thickness. And then later on I add a membrane. I've used this technique for a couple of dragons before, and it's worked pretty well in my experience, especially if you're going to remesh it later and sculpt in the remaining details. Now I move back to the head and body again and mess around a bit there, adding a bit more detail and remeshing. Again using my main 4 brushes. You'll notice I move around a lot while sculpting and don't necessarily stick to one piece at a time, which isn't necessarily great for a time-lapse, but I prefer to work that way, and generally I found it helps my models turn out better. At this point I also add in the eyes. I add a mirror modifier to them and set the mirror object to the head. That way I can move them around and scale them and stuff, but they still stay symmetrical. Next I model the legs and tail. They're part of the same object as the skeleton part of the wings, so using a skin modifier, because the membranes are going to be connected to them too. By the way, if you didn't already know, you can use Ctrl A to adjust the thickness of the skin modifier, which is how I made the legs thicker. And now I make a couple more tweaks to the general shape. When I'm happy with how everything looks, I duplicate the object and then remove the skin modifier from the copy. So now I just have the simple wireframe shape of the wings and can fill in the membrane. When the general shape is down, I add in a couple of support loops and such, just to make sure everything is connected where it should be. Then I go around tweaking and editing stuff with proportional editing on, just to make sure everything looks about right. And finally I add a solidify modifier so that the wing has thickness, so that way later on when I merge everything together and remesh it, I can continue adding the remaining details in sculpt mode without running into some weird artifacting issues. Now I move back to the face for a while and add a little bit more detail there. Now I grab both of the objects that the wing is made up of and apply all the modifiers on them and then press Ctrl J to join them. With that done, I can now go into sculpt mode and tweak them some more. I use the inflate brush to mess around with the thickness of the fingers in the wings and use my snake hook tool as well as the pose brushes to adjust the general shape and pose of the wings. During this part of the process, I switch between having topology automasking on and off quite a bit, because sometimes I want to affect everything, and sometimes I only want to affect very specific parts, for example, only the fingers without affecting the membrane. Now I go back to the face for a while and model the eyelashes from a very basic plain object with a solidify modifier and some subdivision surface, and I mirrored it across the head the same way I did for the eyes. Now I mess around with the hair, though I delete this version later and start over. And I also add in some small teeth, which are just spheres that I pulled out a bit with the snake hook. Now I go back to detailing all over different parts of the model again, tweaking stuff and moving things around a bit, creasing edges and smoothing things out as usual. Now I edit the eyes. I just go into edit mode and move some stuff around since it's just a basic sphere. While I'm around there, I also add lower eyelashes, which I do exactly the same way and even in the same object as the top ones. I also go back to the wing for a bit and mess around with the thumb to make it into a proper finger. At this point, I'm pretty happy with how it's going, so I grab all my main objects, that being the head, the body, the wings, and the ears, and apply all the mirror modifiers, turn off symmetry, and start adding some asymmetry, changing the pose around and stuff, so that it's not as symmetrical and a bit more organic. And then I merge them all into one object and continue tweaking and adjusting the pose and stuff. Now I add a second finger to the wing so that she can actually hold stuff and it's not just one singular thumb. And with everything pretty much in place, I remesh it and essentially make it into one solid mesh, where I can now sculpt in the remaining details and figure the rest out. I keep the eyes, eyelashes, teeth, and stuff like that separate because they don't really need to be a part of the main object, and the more things you keep separate, in my opinion, the easier it is to manage. From here I just start creasing some edges and smoothing stuff out just to clean everything up and add a bit more detail. I also give her a pair of earrings, which are just toruses I added and rotated into place. Now I go back to the hair and mess around with that a little bit more, but eventually I decide I just really don't like how this version is going, so I delete it and start over. I just add in a couple of spheres and use my snip hook tool again to pull them into shape and remesh them so that the topology stays consistent. I could have probably used curves for this part, but I find them a little bit inconvenient to use, so I just sculpted it. I really should practice using curves again though, they are quite useful for particular kinds of hair. Now I finally add the eyebrows, they're part of the same object as the eyelashes. And with that done, I just do a couple of final tweaks and finish everything up so that I can move on to the next stage, which is painting. I made a couple of sketches in Krita so that I would know what kind of colors I wanted her to have, so that way the whole painting process was quite straightforward. I just grabbed my brush with a fairly high opacity and painted in all the basic colors I wanted. Then I lowered the opacity and used Shift to blend stuff out and add a couple of interesting gradients and stuff like that. And at the very end I also go in with a smaller brush and add a couple of darker details in places, just to add a bit more depth. Now for the eye, I went into edit mode and selected the part of the eye I wanted to color, and in sculpt mode I made that into a face set, and from there I could just mask out the face set and paint in the eye in the colors I wanted. By the way, as I mentioned before, if you can't find the sculpt brushes, check the beginning of my lily video, I explain where they're hidden there. One thing I didn't mention there that's very useful for vertex painting is making a custom studio light. In the preferences under lights you can go in and make a custom one. I like making one that's just pretty much white with just a bit of shadows, so that way you can actually see the colors you're painting with and it's not slightly grayed out like it would usually be when you're using a matte cap or the basic pre-existing studio lights. Now I make a second vertex color set, which I paint black and white, and that's going to be a mask for subsurface scattering, so that later on while shading I can make the wings quite translucent and have the rest of the body still be solid. I use white for the parts that I want translucent and black for the parts that I don't want translucent, and different levels of gray for stuff in between. Here I ran into a couple of issues with the sculpt mode vertex colors. When I had 2 of them in a shader, Blender would crash. The solution I found for that was just to go into the properties and under vertex color add a new set of regular vertex colors, and then under the sculpt mode vertex colors to take the new group I had made and then select store sculpt vertex colors, and that would make it into a regular vertex color set, which would then work without crashing Blender. And now I finally move on to lighting and shading. I already have my lighting setup stored in my startup file just to speed things up. It's just a simple background plane and a couple of lights, but it speeds my process up a little bit to already have them there, since I pretty much use the same lighting setup for all my sculpts. For the shader itself, I just plug in both of the vertex color sets I'd made into the color and the subsurface scattering for my principled shader, and then I just messed around a bit, added a color ramp, and just adjusted some of the values until I was happy with how it looked. And as a final little touch, I modeled a little moon and added a solidify modifier to it, and then gave it a white emission shader and used that as a highlight for the eyes. And she's done. This has been my last sculpt for October, so I guess it's kind of my Halloween special. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe and stuff. I also have a Discord server, so if you want to share art or just hang out and chat or see some of my art a bit earlier, feel free to join that. It's a very nice place. And yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed this video, and see you all next time.